Hello Internet, this is your daily dose of data science. Today we are going to continue with the simple project that we have been working on for the past couple of days. Today we are going to serve the data through an API. The data that I'm talking about is the Airbnb data that we have been working with in the past few videos. And in the last video, we moved the data from a CSV file into a table in Postgres database. Today, we are going to serve that data as an API. As a data scientist, sometimes you have to do data engineering bit, and most of the work that you do in terms of data engineering is ETL, orchestration of the data. That's why I showed you how to write how to copy the CSV file into a Postgres database table, and that the link to that video is on the top right in that eye icon. You can click on that and watch it later, or in the description we can also find the link to that video that helps you to copy data from CSV file into Postgres database. And it has different ways. I did it through the interface of pgadmin, and I did it on the terminal, and also used Python to copy the data. So today we are going to create an API. In case your organization wants you to share data with other organizations through an API, this is what you are likely to be doing. So I'm going to show you how to share data through an API. So we are going to build an API using Fast API to share this data as a table. So I'm going to jump onto my VS Code. Where is it? I created a folder here called Airbnb API, and hopefully this will be clear. Just going to make this bigger when you start coding, and also the link to this code. After I have completed this, I'm going to put the link in the description. You can find the link to the whole project that we've been working on for the past few days, on how to clean Airbnb data, then moving the data to the database, and now we want to create an API that shares the data. You'll find the whole of that code in the repository, and the link to the code is in the description. So let's start. When using Fast API, the most common file that people see is the main file, because that is the entry to the API. So I'm going to have main.py. Then I'm going to create other files that will help us define objects that will connect to the database. And the style of coding here we're going to use is ORM, object relation mapping, where we create classes that represent tables in the database. Then the attributes of the classes will represent the columns, and the instances of the classes will represent the rows of the table. So the first thing that we need will be database.py. You can name it anything. You can name these files anything you want, apart from main.py, because if you rename the main.py, there's some changes that you'll have to make in Fast API in order to run the API or to launch the server. Yeah, so database.py will contain our connections. Then I'm going to also have, from database.py, we're going to also create the models. So models.py. So the models of py will be the representations of our tables. Then we're going to have schemas. So schemas.py. So schemas.py will contain the description. It's like a definition of how the data should look like, the shape of the data that is going to the API, and the data that is being entered into the API. Like if you post data into the API, schema defines how the data should look like, And if you try to get the data from the API, the schema will also define how the data should look like when you're presenting data to people who are using it. So we're going to use schema. There is models, there is main, and database.py. Then we are going to write our CRUD functions, create, read, update, and delete functions here. So I'm going to have CRUD.py. So hopefully in less than a few minutes, we can be able to serve the data. We only have one table, and what we want is to share the data. We don't expect someone to post data into our API, so it is going to be a very simple API endpoint that only gets data. So let's start by defining our database.py. So here we are using SQL Alchemy as the package that is going to be managing our ORM. You can use any other, but for this case, we're going to use SQL Alchemy. It has a good integration with the Fast API and several API development frameworks like Django or Flask. The other API of Flask, I don't know how it's called. So let's write, we're going to import engine from SQL Alchemy. So from SQL Alchemy, import create engine. So create engine will help us to create the engine to the database when we are connecting to it. Then we are going to declare a base. So from SQL Alchemy .ext.declarative, we need a declarative base. We also need a session maker. So from SQL Alchemy .object relation mapping, we are going to import session maker. So session maker will help us to define a handler to our database. Then I'm going to create connection parameters here because we need to connect. You'll see how it will work anyway. So let's create the database URL to SQL Alchemy. So we're going to have this variable called SQL Alchemy underscore database URL. So this variable will be equal to so we are going to put here a link to the database and the logins to the database also. So it is Postgres and /, then here we're going to have user. Yeah, so I need to have connection parameters. So from here I'm going to import connection parameters as CP. So this connection parameters does not exist in this folder. I'm going to create it. CP dot that. So that is the user :password. So we're going to have CP dot password. Then my database, the host of the database is my computer, so it is local host, and the database itself is YouTube. So I need to define my connection parameters. I'm going to first pause the video here, I define them, then I come back so that you don't see the password and the user that I normally use for these videos. Yeah, so I have defined my connection parameters here. It's majorly a username and a password to the database. I use this password a lot on my videos, and it's related to lots of the videos that I use, and it's quite a weird password. That's why I don't want to show you. Yep, so let's continue. So we have we have this variable created. Then now we are going to define our engine. So our engine is going to be create engine, then with this link to the Postgres database. So if your database is not Postgres, if you're using SQLite, you'll need to pass in an argument here to tell it to use multiple connections at the same time. Yep, so after this we are going to create a session using session maker, and the session we're going to create, we're going to call it locals. So this is just a session object, and the session object is going to create a session that will be binding the engine. So session, not session maker, so I'm going to call it session local one. Is going to be session maker, and the session maker, we don't want it to auto commit, so auto commit is false. We also don't want it to auto flash, so auto flash is false, but we want to bind it to the engine, so bind equals to engine that we created. Then we are going to create a base class, so our base is going to be declarative base. Yeah, so this is how we are defining our connections in the database. We are going to use this most of this base and local session in main.py later, but this is how we are going to define our database. So next we are going to create our model, the models, and the model will depend on the way our table looks like, because our model is our table. So there are several columns in this table, and I am going to copy these columns from where we defined where we define this table. Then we are going to create the model from there. But for now, I don't know why my computer is hanging. For now, let's start by importing what we need. So we are going to import data types. So from SQL Alchemy, we are going to import column. So column will help us to create columns in the model, and then the data types boolean. There was a boolean value, as I remember. Then string, integer we shall use int, then float. I think we should also use integer. There is integer and date. I doubt if there is something else that we use that is not here. Then from database, from what we just created, from this we're going to import the base class. Then we are going to create our model, and the model should inherit from the base class. So our class A, B, and B, it should inherit from the base class for it to be the model. Then the table name is Airbnb. Airbnb. My mouse has failed to work. I don't know why. So now let's define our columns. I'm going to use the columns that we used in creating the table in the previous video, so that they will guide me in defining the data types for this table. I think it should be like that. So ID is a variable character. So we are going to replace, I'm going to remove all variable characters. Alt that. In fact, I'm going to remove all the data types. At least I have the names of the columns. So I'm going to find float and I replace it with nothing. Replace all. Also bool. Replace all. Also variable character. Replace all in that file. Also integer. So these were data types. No, I'm not done. I want to only remove this. So this is these are the data types that we used in defining the table in Postgres that I'm removing so that I can remain with the columns. And now we are going to define the columns. Each of these will have an equal sign, so I'm going to assign all the equal signs at the same time. Yeah, that was long. So that each of these data type is equal to something. Then column will be added here. In fact, I can also use the find and replace. I put column. I should find a comma in this file and I replace with column, open and close, and comma. Then I replace all. And now we have column everywhere apart from here. So let's start with the ID. What is an ID? The ID, the data type of the ID is a string, and it is also the primary key. So primary key is true. And index is also true. It's true. It should have index. Then the host ID, this is giving us an error, and I want to find out why is from Tkinter. Why am I importing from Tkinter? It should be from SQL Alchemy column. So it should be one column. Nice. Then string. Oh, it replaced the columns with I get because of what we did the other side. Okay. So this is going to be boolean date. Let me import these things again. So this is going to be boolean. Then there should be a float. Then there should be a string. Then there should be a date. Then there should be, I think those are all. So here it is a string, it's okay. Then the host verified, it is a boolean because it is a true or false, and the default it should be false. Default value, so the default value for this boolean should be false. Then neighborhood group is a string. The latitude is a float. The longitude also is a float. Then the instant bookable is a boolean, and the default is also false. So we're going to have this as a boolean. The cancellation policy is a string. So this is a string. The room type is also a string. The construction year is an integer. Did we import integer? We did not. Integer. Then the price is a float. I think most of them remaining are floats until the date. Last review, this should be date, and then the missing house rules is also a boolean. Missing house rules is a boolean. This is a string. Yeah, then the rest are floats. So I'm going to copy this and I paste here, 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 and here. Availability in 365. Yeah. So this it's looking so big. This is our model. We only have one model, one table in our database that we want to serve data. So this is how we define our model, and it's more of the class that defines the model. It inherits from the base class. Remember, we defined the base class here. Then the name of the table, area, this should be airbnb. Then these are the columns of the table, which are attributes to this class, the columns of that table. So this is how we define our model. If you have several tables, you'll do the same for as many tables as you have. Now we are going to define the schemas, and these schemas will give the shape of the data, or they will define the shape of the data when it is being posted to the database, or when we are writing it to the database, and also when we are reading it from the database and serving it through the API. So we're going to define the schemas here. So for the schema, I'm going to start defining them. I'm going to use base model from Pydantic to define the schema. So the model from Pydantic is different from our models here, because our models here are the models that define the table, but the models from Pydantic are the models that define the schema. They should not confuse you. So Pydantic import base model, not base config, base model. Then we define our class, and our class is area Airbnb base so that it does not clash, and it is inheriting from base model. Then we are going to define the columns. So this Airbnb base class is a class that is base for both. It contains the shape of the data that will both be written on and read from. But if you want to have a class that we are going to define a class that is going to show only the data that is read and only the data that is written on. So the columns that will be in both read and write will be inside this base class. So I'm just going to copy the columns I created here because I doubt if I can remember all of them. Yeah, so we have these columns. The definition of Airbnb base does not use equal sign, so we're going to remove everything after equal sign here for all the columns. In fact, we are going to replace equal with colon. So let's find equal sign. Hopefully this time around it will not update with some stuff that we didn't expect. Run all. Then we have errors. So an ID, the ID, I don't want the ID to be here, but you can leave it if you want. Then this is a boolean, so this should be bool. This is a string, so this will be string str. Find, replace float with float, replace all. Then we find this, remove this comma, remove this comma. So we find this, we are going to replace with bool, replace all. This calculated hosting listing is a float. It seems I didn't update it here. It should be a float here. So in schemas we have that. We don't need any comma. Alt click. So we're going to find string. Remember, this is Pydantic, it is not SQL Alchemy. So that, and then we're going to find integer, and we are going to replace it with that. We have this comma, that comma. So here we have defined, I need a date. Date needs to be gotten from, the type of date is going to be gotten from date time. So from date time, import date. So date is going to use the class of date. So these types that we are defining here for our schema are the ones that we are going to do data validation whenever data is being posted to the API. So if you post a string and it is expecting a float, it's going to return an error for you. So it will be expecting a float, an int, and a string and a boolean here. And this is the same data type, the ones that we have defined for our tables here, because this is our table and then this is our schema. Next, we are going to work on our CRUD methods. So with the CRUD methods, we're going to write the functions that will help us to create, read, update and delete data in our database. You can write all of them here, and for our challenge, what we are going to do today is only writing methods that will read our database. So we're going to use a session from object relation mapping in SQL Alchemy. So from SQL Alchemy.orm import session. So this session is different from the session we have here in the session maker. This session maker is helping us to define a session just like this one, but this is a different session. This is a session that will help you to have methods like querying, and mostly I'm importing this here so that it can help me to query, but this is the one that defines the handler, and it is the one that that has created a handler for us in our database. So that's how you should differentiate them. Then I'm going to import my models from this import models. We have already written models and schema. Schemas, we have already written schemas. Then we are going to define a function that will help us to get data. So get airbnb, so this will get only one record from Airbnb. So we'll expect the session, that will be db, the session. Then we are going to also expect an ID. So I'm going to call it Airbnb ID, and this is a string. Then we are going to return query, so the db.query. So what we are going to return here is the result of this query. So the query will be models. So we are querying models.airbnb. That's the table that we are querying here, this one. Then we are going to ensure that we are getting only that data that is requested. So we're going to filter, and we are filtering by models.airbnb.id equals to Airbnb ID. Then if that ID is not unique, we should return the first value. Return first. Next, we are going to write the same method, but for querying several items. So I could just copy this function, and then I say get Airbnbs. We need a session, we don't need this. Then we are going to get several records from the database. So what we are going to do, we are going to have the value for skipping, like how many records do you want us to skip. It's an integer, and it should be equal to 0. The default value is 0. Then the limit, we don't expect someone to have everything, to like call for everything. More so an API, and this will help in pagination. So the limit is also an integer, and it should be equal to 100. Someone can set their own limits when they are when they're paginating. So here we have this function. So we are querying Airbnb models. Then we are going to offset by the skip. Then we are going to limit by the limit that is passed. Then we want all the values, not the first. Then just going to write a placeholder function here for create, but we are not going to implement it. So create Airbnb. So you can continue, look at the code and see how to implement, how to create data. So this is going to be db session, the same thing. Then we are going to get Airbnb. I don't know why I'm implementing this. I will stop at some moment. So schemas dot Airbnb create. Did I call it base? No, this should be create, not base. Should be create. Really? No, this is base. I don't know why I'm confusing myself. This is our base. Our base. My schema. Let me just leave this here. I don't want to confuse you and me. This is going to be a pass. I'm not going to implement this, but let it be a challenge for you to implement. Yeah, so this is our create, read, update, and delete. Now we need to define our main file to help us run the API and manage it. So we need from first API. You make sure that the package is installed. You can check the first API site on how to install. We are going to use first API. Then we are going to create an object or instantiate an object. So app equals to first API. Then we are going to define the dependency for the database handler. So async for it to be asynchronous, but I don't know if we need it to be asynchronous. Let's just define it. Get db, and this function does not take anything. The db will be equal to the local session, the session local one, and we are going to import that from the database. So from .database we are going to import local session 1 and engine, because we're going to use both of them. So this is session local 1. Then we're going to try to yield this, yield db, then finally we are going to do db.close. So this dependency, we are going to use it in the following function. So remember, when you hit the API, you have a route through the API that you are going to use to request for a resource. So we're going to define a get function here, and it's going to be using this decorator .app.get. So remember, the app is already defined here. Dot get, so this is for the get method, and it's going to be airbnb slash, and the response mode should be a list of the schema. So response model should be defined as the list, and it should be the schemas, and the schemas dot airbnb. Do we have airbnb in the schemas? We don't have. We shall see how to define it if it is not there. So we need to import some stuff that we are going to use. Yeah, so schemas, and I have just realized that we did not complete writing the schemas for Airbnb, because what we wrote here is just the definition of what the database, the data should look like when you're reading and writing, but we have not defined how the data should look like when you are writing and how the data should look like when you're reading. So we're going to define two classes, but let's first complete this main, then we'll go back and write what we are missing. So let me just define the two classes so that we don't have the errors. So class Airbnb create, that's why I was having a confusion with this. So Airbnb create, I'm going to pass for now, then class Airbnb. So the Airbnb create will contain only the columns that will be used when you are posting data into the API. So if there are extra columns, for example, when you're posting a password, they will be passed here. These two classes inherit from the base, so they inherit these values here, and it will be only this function that will be this class that will be used when you're writing, because it will have everything plus the extra columns that you don't expect to be shown when you're reading, for example, password. So here I'm going to have some columns, and here also some columns, but that will be done later. Let's complete main. So we have schemas Airbnb. Okay, so let's define our function, and the function that is being decorated is read Airbnbs. And when we are reading, we want to see what we are going to skip, and skip the same as the other function we saw when we are defining the CRUD. Then the limit is also an integer, and the limit is going to be, by default is 100. Someone can change it. Then the DB is now on this dependency here. So we're going to import a dependency. We're going to import dependency from Fast API. Depends, should be depends. And so it's going to be DB the DB, and the DB is depending on, so it is of a type session, Yep, so the DB is going to use the session. We have not imported this session. We are going to import it from ORM, so from sqlalchemy.orm import session. Yep, so this session is going to be, so the DB session is going to be, is going to depend on the getDB function. So we're going to use the depends that we imported, and we're going to use the getDB function. Yeah, so those are the parameters. We are going to get the values of Airbnbs. So the function that we are using is this that we have written. We're going to get all. You can try to implement this one and see what will happen. But for our case, we're going to use only this. You will also try to implement this and see what will happen. This will use the create DB. We haven't used the schema, so I'm going to remove the schemas. So where are we? Main.py Airbnbs equals to CRUD. Did we import CRUD? We did not import CRUD, so we're going to import CRUD here from this import CRUD, and we're also going to import models so that I don't use this. So models, then we're also going to import schemas. So here we're going to have the schemas. We have this, so CRUD.get get Airbnbs, and we are passing the DB as a session. Skip is a skip, and limit is limit. And hopefully this is going to help us. We haven't used models. You may use them in writing. We could create here a piece of code. I'm going to just write it, but I'm not going to use it. Models. This. Let me remove this. Let me just use that models. Dot base. So this will help you to migrate the database or auto create the tables for you in the database that you've defined, but I'm not going to use because we have already defined the table and we have the data inside the table, but I'm going to write it here and leave it here as a comment. Create all, and we bind it to engine. Yeah, so this just one line of code will help you do a lot of migrations. We are not going to use that. So this is the full definition of our API. Hopefully everything is going to work. So we are going to write in the terminal here. We're going to start our API. So first API uses UV icon. Then we're going to run this instance that we have created here. So main, and then app, and we want whenever we make changes to reload. Run that. So we have from database import this, we have an error here in line 4. And the error is saying import session unknown parent package import error. So let's jump into debugging this. So here I think the code is not seeing this, so I'm going to remove this because they're in the same folder to import them directly. So this from .database, so I should just say from database. Then this is in database.py. I should just import connection parameters. The module named connection parameters connection. Let me copy this name. Okay, so we have some other, so let's browse through our files and see how we can correct what we have just seen. CRUD, we're going to import models. No such module, can't plug in, so let's see how to correct this. Line 2 in create engine, can't load plugin for this dialect. Okay, so this is in database. This should be postgresql unknown package in database from .database import. No, it's not in database, it should be in models. So this we are going to do, remove this dot. Which other error are we seeing here? Oh, it should be table name. Let's say Airbnb does not have done the table. This should be double underscore. Could not ensemble any primary key columns for this. So primary key here is true. So if primary key here is true, yeah, so these columns are not, these commas are not needed here. So let's see, and voila, so the API is running. Let me stop it, then run it again. It is running here. So we're going to go to this link in our browser. This route is not found, but if we look at the docs, we will see first API Airbnb, and we can now query the docs. There is a sample data that is shown here. I can make this bigger. So let's test this data, this endpoint. We are going to skip 0, limit 100, and execute. So we have an error, and the error is saying, let's look at the API, not found. So let's check the route that we have given this. There should be a slash airbnb. So let's go back to our routes here. There should be a slash here. Let it reload. Let's reload this, and let's query the API again. Try it out. Click on try it out, execute. Server error again, and this time around none type is not allowed. Yep, so it's failing because our schema is Airbnb. When we look at our schemas here, we have not defined these schemas. So let's define this, and let's define these two schemas. So our first schema here, I'm going to pass in the ID as a string. Then also this, I'm going to pass in the ID as a string. But for this, we are going to ensure that this class is configured to be in ORM mode. So class config, and we're going to say ORM mode should be true. So hopefully this fixes the API problem. So this is going to tell, this ORM mode true is going to tell the Pydantic model to read the data not as a dictionary. So let's try to run this again. The server is running. We put reload equals to true so that we don't need to reload it every time. Let's try out the endpoint. Execute. There is a server error. None is not allowed. Okay, so where would this problem be from? Let me try to execute again. Okay, so there is something wrong with the validation, and it could be from CRUD, it could be from anywhere. So here the problem is from what we are going to do with the data. We're supposed to return it. Yeah, let me call this Airbnbs because there are many. Then let me run this again, then try out, execute. Status code is 200. Nice. So we have our response here of the data. We could run this with any client software and it would bring the same data. So here we have each of the row in our table here as a JSON object. I can see mine in browser like this because I have an extension installed called JSON formatter, but you could see yours as raw as this. Yeah, so that's how you connect to Postgres using Fast API and serve your data through an API endpoint. You'll find the link to the code in the description. Until tomorrow, learn something, teach someone, and don't forget to